I've clicked onto the global tropical overview for June the 28th, 2024. As is always the case in these videos, the politics pressure are mine alone, and in making any decisions ahead of any tropical cyclones, look to our local office, local emergency management, and local tropical cyclone warning center. So we have three areas of interest in the Atlantic today to watch. We have Invest 94L sitting in the Western Caribbean, which is forecast to cross the Yucatan Peninsula this weekend and move into the Bay of Campeche, where development is possible in that time frame before it moves into Mexico and dies over the high terrain of that region. We also have Invest 95L sitting way out here in the open tropical Atlantic, and this system is forecast to move west towards the Lesser Antilles as it goes throughout this weekend and into early next week. Current estimate on time of arrival is about Monday or Tuesday, and we could see some impacts there as we go into that time frame. We also have another tropical wave behind 95L moving off of Africa today, and this system might have a chance to develop into a tropical storm as in the tropical Atlantic as it moves west throughout this weekend and into early next week. But today we're going to focus only on 94L and 95L. I'm going to briefly touch on 94L before going to 95L. If you would like to skip ahead to this part of the video where I talk about 95L, I will leave a timestamp in the description. But we're going to first start off with 94L as it sits very close to land right now in the Western Caribbean. You can see it moving now north of Honduras here. And the system is still fairly disorganized, still an open wave. You can tell that if you look at the low-level clouds. We have some southeasterly winds coming out of the Southern Caribbean, turning into easterly winds east of the Yucatan Peninsula. And this denotes a wave axis that is generally like that here, centered here in the Western Caribbean. And the system is also producing a lot of just disorganized convection on the north side of this wave pocket. You can see there's a lot of sporadic bursts of convection. They're not really concentrating in the one specific area. And it's also dealing with some shear and dry air. That dry air you can see as we have some outflow boundaries, which is an indication of dry air getting into thunderstorms and causing thunderstorms to immediately collapse once they go up. So all things right now are just disorganized for this wave, but things will get a little bit more favorable once it tracks a little bit further west and gets into the Bay of Campeche. One thing that the system is right now is it's tilted a little bit more diagonal. You can see that where I denoted the wave axis, where it looks like this line here goes from about Honduras to almost Grand Cayman in the Cayman Islands. Now, one thing that's going to happen as the system comes into Mexico is this northern lobe of the wave is going to swing towards the west, and this is going to cause the wave, once it comes over the Yucatan Peninsula, to be a little bit more vertical. So from south to north, the wave axis will be fairly vertical or straight as it comes into the Yucatan Peninsula. And this is a little bit more favorable. This can be better at causing this wave to, close off a circulation and could aid the system in developing that low pressure that is needed for tropical development. And you can see this happen on the GFS. This is the current analysis on it, and you can see the wave axis is still a little bit diagonal right now. But as we go into tonight, once it comes over the Yucatan Peninsula, it becomes more vertical overall. And as that happens, we also get a little bit more curvature on the north side of this wave pocket. Now, will not be a tropical cyclone by this point, as it is still an open wave axis. But point being, the wave axis by this time is much more vertical, and this would be a better sign for it once it does come into the Bay of Campeche. Now, right now, the system is dealing with, like I said, a little bit of shear from an upper trough over the Yucatan Peninsula and Cuba, but this system is going to be able to fight this off a little bit. We talked about this a few days ago, how all this convection that's blowing up in the Western Caribbean is going to contribute to an area of high pressure aloft that's going to be able to fight off this trough at least a little bit. And you can see that happen here on this run. So this is the same time frame as when it's moving over the Yucatan Peninsula. You can see that this trough is thinning out on this model. This orange streak is this trough, and it's thinning out as this upper high gets pumped by the convection. And this is causing a little bit less shear over the system. Now, one thing is this trough is not going to fully go away. What's going to happen eventually is we're going to get an area of low pressure aloft cutting off from the rest of the trough. So you have general troughiness like this across the basin. And what this bridge is sort of doing is it's sort of pinching off this area of low pressure on the western end of this trough. So that you'll see eventually, once the system moves into the Bay of Campeche, we don't have that full trough over the Gulf of Mexico streaming over it, but we have more of an area of low pressure over it. And I can show you this better on the 200 millibar flows. This is the upper level flow plot, and you can see that we have this area of low pressure aloft sitting over the low. So this may cause some shear for it as it's on the eastern end of it, so this would be causing some southerly flow upon it, but it is still underneath an upper high, and the shear is not likely to be all too high. If we get a sounding from the GFS over the low, which at this time it has it focused over the southern Bay of Campeche, whenever the sounding does low, but you can see that the wind shear is not overly high. It's 11 knots. Now that is getting into a moderate category, but that wouldn't be likely fully inhibitive for the system to develop. And one thing that also may go in its favor is the land topography in this part of the world. We have a lot of high terrain here in the Bay of Campeche, and one thing the Bay of Campeche is very good for, or good at doing, is spinning up little quick tropical cyclones as an effect of all the high terrain. Some of the terrain can play with the vorticity or spin that we have going on here, and it can help tighten up some circulations through that process, and you can get a brief tropical storm from it. And the GFS does show a little bit of additional development with the system. Now, I don't know if it fully gets to a tropical cyclone by this time, but it does get fairly close on this run, and this is probably the higher end solution for this low. That would be a weak tropical storm coming into mainland Mexico. The more likely scenario right now is that the system remains just a broad low when it does come in, like the GFS showed in its earlier run. But it is still possible that the system does develop into a tropical storm, and the National Hurricane Center does show that potential with them giving it a 30% chance of development. Not very high odds, but the odds are there for tropical development to occur. Now, regardless of development, the main impact is going to continue to be rainfall. We've had a lot of rainfall over the past couple of days in Central America, and for mainland Mexico, the main impact is still going to be rainfall, tropical storm, or wave. You can see that we have some areas of increased rainfall, which does not seem like much. It's about 100 to 150 millimeters, but this is falling in a fairly quick period of time, and with the high terrain here, we could absolutely have a lot of flooding issues occur from here. Now, if it did form into a tropical storm, we would likely just have a bit of increased wind impacts along the immediate coastline and maybe some increased onshore flow issues, but that may already still be the same, even if it is an open wave by the time it comes in. All right, let's go back to the big picture view of the Atlantic. So that was Invest 94L in the Western Caribbean, but now we're going to focus for the rest of the video on Invest 95L here in the tropical Atlantic. This system is doing fairly well for itself, and I'll go to the close-up visible loop so you can see it in close detail. You can see that this looks like a system you would have in August or September in the MDR. The system is very close to being a tropical storm. Some of the key aspects of tropical storms that you can notice from this is these curved bands of thunderstorms moving into what appears to be the center of circulation underneath some sustaining deep convection. Now, the National Hurricane Center has not yet designated this as a tropical storm or tropical cyclone. Not sure if it will be a tropical depression or storm right now. And the reason for that is there does appear to be a little bit of elongation towards the east. You can see that we have westerly winds on the south side of this, but we don't have this very quick curve into southerly winds on the eastern side of this convection. It does take a little bit for these winds to curve around on the eastern side of this before fully turning into westerly winds. So we have a low pressure system that is a little bit elongated in nature underneath this convection. Now, this is really the only problem for the system standing in its way of being a tropical storm. Once this circulation does tighten up, it will have met the definition of a tropical storm. And this is pretty well forecast by the GFS. The GFS has really been doing really well with this storm. It wanted the system to be forming about this time, and here we are now with nearly a tropical cyclone. Now, if we look aloft, the environment is also getting a little bit more favorable for the system. We have an upper level high now draping over the system, unusual for June, but it is here. And this is going to favor a fairly low shear environment as the system moves west towards the Lesser Antilles Islands. Now, there are still some issues for the system. If we go to, and I'll go to the true color imagery so we can see this maybe a little bit better, you can see where the storm is right now. And if you look north, we have a lot of stratocumulus clouds streaming westwards across the MDR. And what this is just a lot of dry air northeast of the system. And you can see that in the water vapor loop. We have really just no coloring here in this part of the world. And this is just showing that we just have a lot of dry air, which is normal this time of year. This is one reason why a lot of storms struggle this time of year. They usually just suck in dry air, and that is it for them. They aren't able to come back from that. Now, one thing going in 95L's favor is it's within the monsoon trough right now in intertropical convergence zone. So we have a lot of deep tropical moisture favoring it right now. And you can see that on the GFS mid-level relative humidity plot, where it's got a fairly well-structured bubble of moisture around it. But we do still have this dry air looming off towards the north. And this will be an area of concern for any disruption to the system. If we do get any entrainment from any of this dry air, this could cause some hiccups in the storm's intensification as it comes north or generally west-northwest. You can see some indication of this potentially happening on the GFS. If you look at the coloring, now it's not very clear that we're getting a big dry air intrusion on the model, but we have this tongue of lighter greens here on the south and east side of the storm, which could be an indication of some of this dry air getting surrounded by the system. Now, the key thing there would be how well structured is the moisture bubble in front of the storm. Or what I mean by that rather is around the center of circulation. So does it have a well-built moisture bubble like this? If it does have a moisture bubble like this, given the environment that we have with that area of high pressure aloft, the thing should be good for intensification all the way up to the Lesser Antilles. And you can see the GFS does show this, showing a hurricane coming through the Windward Islands as we get into Monday of next week. Now, the GFS is a bit aggressive on this. You can see that 968 millibar pressure on there. That's pretty strong for the time of year. And I do think the GFS is going a little bit too strong here. It's a bit hard to believe just given the time of year that we're in. But I will say, given the environment that we have, it is certainly within a realm of possibility that if the system gets well developed enough, we could see a phase of quicker intensification that could get something like this. And you can see this if we look at the ship's guidance. This is a model which shows rapid intensification potential of a system over the next 3 days. And you can see that in some cases, like in 30 miles per hour in 24 hours, 75 miles per hour in 72 hours. We have some fairly significant rapid intensification odds. And this is a very real potential that we could be dealing with a quick or rapidly intensifying storm, given the unusually favorable environment for the time of year. So this is something to definitely watch in the Lesser Antilles. Now, the National Hurricane Center, I'd imagine, are going to be initiating advisories on this later today, especially if it gets the center tightened up. And once that happens, just make sure you're staying closely tuned to their advisories, as they're going to be putting those out every 6 hours. And once tropical storm or hurricane watches go in place every 3 hours, and they'll have information on rainfall and what winds you can expect as the system comes through. And right now, what I can tell you from what I expect for the system is I would expect at least a high-end tropical storm coming through here with the environment. I think even if it does get a little bit of a dry air entrainment, it could still work that out, and we could still get some fairly decent intensification from it. Alongside that, keep in mind that we have a fairly tight pressure gradient on the northern side of this. Not the highlighter, let me get the full marker. We have a fairly tight pressure gradient, so we have 10, 14 millibars, like I talked about this a few days ago, and then whatever the low pressure is here. So that's even 980 millibars. That's a very tight gradient here, and this would be very strong winds. And for areas, especially wherever the storm tracks just north of the center, that could be a very strong storm coming through, and you could easily have high-end tropical storm force winds, maybe hurricane force winds as well. And we'll also be dealing with likely some storm surge issues as well along the immediate coastlines, and heavy rainfall is a given as well with the system as it does come through. Now, Talking about different scenarios for the intensification, I did touch on the dry air that could get entrained. The European model is on the idea of the system being maybe a little bit more disrupted, maybe a little bit more shear in place. There has been times where the European has shown a little bit of tilt vertically in the atmosphere with the system, maybe an indication of stronger surface winds compared to the upper level winds, but it also could be dry air issues. You can see compared to the GFS, if you look at the moisture bubble when it's coming through the Caribbean islands, this is much more of a deep green than the European shows. The European has much more of a lighter green, indicating that maybe we have a little bit more dry air getting into the system and getting mixed into all of this moisture that it has. And that could cause the system to struggle quite a bit more. Now, the European also does have a tendency to go a bit weak on this. Now, it's hard to say exactly if this is the European having a weaker bias or if this is an actual scenario. Personally, I feel like this type of scenario is a little bit too weak for the environment, but it's within the realm of possibility. Though, for what it's worth, the European has shown in prior runs, in fact, just last night's run, a stronger scenario like the GFS. And I feel like the European run from last night, that 988 millibar one that's popping up here, I think that's more of a likely scenario here, and that would likely be a high-end tropical storm, maybe a low-end hurricane. Here's the current outlook from the National Hurricane Center, and you can see they're giving this 90% odds of development, both in 2-day and 7-day development odds. And you can see that track coming up towards the Lesser Antilles as we go into the latter half of this week. Now, I want to talk about just quickly the system as it comes into the Caribbean past the Lesser Antilles. So once it passes these islands, what is it going to do once it comes into the Caribbean? Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of answers right now on exactly what's going to happen, but we can get some clues just from the environment that the models are showing ahead of the storm in the Caribbean. This is the 850 millibar, so a little bit off the surface, wind plot from the GFS showing you the winds at that level of the atmosphere. So the winds that you see here in the storm, those are not at surface level, those are a little bit off the ground, and same with the Caribbean winds. One thing that's been consistently shown on models is very strong trade winds, as you would expect this time of year in the Caribbean. And you can see that, especially in the Central Caribbean, we have some trade winds of 40 plus miles per hour in the Central Caribbean. Now you may ask, is that going to be a big issue in the Eastern Caribbean if we have these centered over the Central Caribbean? And it still likely would. Reason being is that as these winds increase in speed into the Central Caribbean, it helps dry out the atmosphere. It's low-level divergence. It helps dry it out in this part of the Caribbean. And that would likely leave a very dry pocket of air ahead of the storm, and that could easily be entrained into the center of 95L when it's coming through. Now, apart from the trade winds, as some models have shown the system being resilient enough to fend off the effects of the usual TC graveyard in the Eastern Caribbean, there will likely be a little bit of shear from an upper trough digging in over the Western and Central Caribbean. What's happening is we have a big area of high pressure ballooning over the southern United States, and what this is helping form is it's helping form an area of troughiness here draping into the Caribbean. And as the system comes west, strength will be key. And this was sort of what we talked about with 94L. You can see as it comes in, the GFS does show a fairly strong low. We have this big area of high pressure ahead of the storm, and this is sort of setting up a barrier, if you will, ahead of the storm that's going to act to try and fight off this trough. And you can see that try to happen on the GFS. We have this upper high here and this sort of defense line from the hurricane, and now it's starting to thin out this trough. But what's also happening by this time is the storm is weakening because of those strong trade winds in the Central Caribbean. And you can see that eventually the upper high begins to weaken a little bit, and then this trough is still sitting here once the system gets west towards Cuba, and then we start getting a lot more shear over the storm. And I wouldn't expect this system to really be able to fully fight off this trough, as this storm is likely to weaken at least somewhat in the Caribbean. Now, one thing that may also be a dictator of it is the exact track. You can see the GFS does take this storm off towards the north, towards Hispaniola. And this would be a scenario where the storm is stronger coming into the Caribbean. So as a stronger storm, it's likely to go further north into this part of the Caribbean. But if it's a weaker storm, one thing is that the trough may still stay strong here, but it would likely be able to stay further south. And if we can get into a potential where, say, the trough is more like this orientation, we could have maybe a bit more of a favorable environment after it passes a strong trade winds here. And the European does show a track like this and a scenario like that in general, where it stays weak, it comes west, and then dives towards Central America, and it does try to intensify a little bit more before it makes landfall in Central America. While the GFS, being a stronger storm, comes close to Cuba and has a storm coming into the Gulf of Mexico eventually. Though by this time, this is getting heavily sheared by this trough, and this would likely be struggling to maintain any form of tropical cyclone status. But this is very long range, so I mean, this is over a week out. This is next Friday, so we have some time to watch this scenario, and there's a lot of things that will be changing. So for those that may be looking at model runs in Hispaniola, Jamaica, Cuba, Mexico, and Central America, just keep in mind there's a lot of things that will change. And just again, like I said in my last video, be wary of certain model runs that may be showing a strong hurricane coming your way. I know a lot of the hurricane models that you would usually trust, and I can go to this right now. I'll show you them, like the H-Wharf here, showing a strong hurricane coming through into Haiti and Jamaica. One thing about these hurricane models is that they're really not all too reliable for invests, especially when you don't have recon of the system. So just be wary of what you see online for this storm. And right now, there's just too much uncertainty to tell you exactly what's going to happen. But what I can tell you is that we'll likely have some form of a tropical entity moving through the Caribbean next week, and that could lead to flooding issues in Hispaniola, Jamaica, and Cuba, especially if it does come north, potentially further south into Central America if it does stay on a more southerly track. But I'll keep you all updated on it. I'll have more videos throughout the weekend into next week. That's all that I've got for today. Again, stay safe in all the areas that are going to be impacted by these storms, and I'll leave links to the National Hurricane Center page at the top of the description. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.